The park bench had been his bed for 2 winters. Nobody cared, not the joggers, not the dog walkers, not the man who kicked his bag and said, "You people don't belong here." But that morning, something was different. When they tried to remove him, the man refused to move, not with violence, but with quiet resolve. What they didn't know was who he used to be and who still remembered. Because 30 minutes later, an army colonel in dress blues stepped into the park and knelt beside him, saluting what others had thrown away. If you believe Valor doesn't vanish with homelessness, type respect in the comments and subscribe for more untold stories of quiet strength. He looked like any other man forgotten by the city. Layers of coats stitched together with years of wind and wear. Boots scuffed to the bone. Beard more gray than black. But if you paid attention, and hardly anyone did, you'd notice the way he sat. Back straight, eyes steady, always watching. Not the erratic flicker of a man unraveling. No, this was something else. Measured, disciplined. His name was Luis M. Rodriguez, but even that had mostly faded. From IDs, from memory, from the conversations of the world around him. He'd once answered to Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Before the medals, before the injury, before the silence that followed. Most days he sat on the same bench by the east fountain of Jefferson Park. He didn't panhandle, didn't ask for food, just read a tattered paperback or polish the silver buckle of a backpack that hadn't seen active duty in over a decade. The local shopkeepers called him Benchman. The kids whispered that he talked to ghosts. But the older veterans, the ones who knew, simply nodded when they passed. They knew that kind of silence. Luis never spoke of the tours, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. He never talked about the mortar that changed everything, or the bureaucratic limbo that swallowed his discharge papers, or the system that lost track of him completely. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. But on that particular morning, something was about to change. Something in the way the wind carried, the way his jaw was set. A city that had ignored him for years was about to learn who Luis Rodriguez really was. And some would regret how long they'd looked the other way. That morning, Luis had only one goal: to hold his ground. The city ordinance was clear: no loitering, no camping, no unnecessary obstruction of public seating. The new park rangers were zealous about enforcing it, and they had received a directive to start clearing benches for public use. Luis had heard the whispers the night before. 2 other homeless vets had been moved the past week. One sent to a shelter that smelled of mold and fear. The other, no one had seen since. Luis knew they'd come for him next. But this bench wasn't just a piece of wood to him. It was the only piece of ground left that hadn't been taken. He had earned his right to sit under that maple tree. He had held ground in far worse places. Sandstorms in Mosul, snowdrifts in Kandahar. He wasn't about to let go of the last place that felt steady beneath his boots. So, when the first ranger approached at 6:43 a.m., clipboard in hand, sunglasses still fogged from the morning chill, Luis didn't flinch. He kept tying his boot, slowly, methodically. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move along," the ranger said, voice firm but rehearsed. Luis looked up, didn't speak, just held the ranger's gaze. "This area is restricted for maintenance today," the ranger added, gesturing vaguely. Luis didn't move. There was no scene, no shouting, no threats, just a quiet refusal to disappear again. The ranger sighed and stepped away, muttering into his radio. Luis leaned back on the bench, closed his eyes for a moment, and breathed in slow. He wasn't waiting for trouble. He was waiting for someone else. It wasn't long before the second ranger arrived. Younger, more aggressive. He didn't lead with words. He led with noise. Slammed the truck door shut, boots crunching across gravel, radio clipped to his shoulder, blaring static. Luis opened one eye. "You've been warned," the ranger snapped, tossing a plastic bag onto the grass. "Pack up your things. Now." Luis didn't move. His pack was already zipped. His coat already buttoned. If they thought he was going to scramble, they didn't understand the kind of discipline that came from years in the field. You can either get in the van or you could be cited and forcibly removed. The ranger continued. There was a crowd now, not large, but enough. A dog walker, a couple sipping coffee, a teenager on a scooter, filming with a phone. No one spoke. They just watched. Louis slowly reached down and picked up a folded flag from beside his boots, the same one that had been draped over his brother's casket. He rested it on his lap like armor. "I'm not trespassing," he said, his voice gravel and calm. "This is public land." "Not when you make it private," the ranger replied, stepping closer. The hand on Louis's shoulder wasn't harsh, but it was enough. And it was a mistake. Louis stood. Not fast, not aggressively, but tall, straighter than anyone expected. A murmur moved through the watching crowd. The ranger's grip loosened. "You don't know who I am," Louis said quietly, "but someone does." He sat back down. The ranger hesitated, then muttered something into his radio. The message was clear: call it in. Get backup. They thought they were dealing with a vagrant. They didn't realize they were standing before a decorated warfighter who'd made peace with far greater threats than policy enforcers. And something was coming. Backup came in waves. First, it was the white SUV with the city seal. Then a man in a blue shirt with a laminated badge and a tablet. Then 2 more park rangers, one female, one tall and annoyed, with vests and earpieces. Louis didn't move. His bag sat at his feet, flag across his knees, palms resting on weathered thighs. Calm, steady still. Across the street, someone had started recording. A local barista stood outside, holding a tray of muffins, forgotten. A city council aide nearby whispered something into a phone, eyes darting from the growing scene to the nervous ranger team. "Sir, we're asking you once more comply," the blue shirt man said, stepping forward. "This is your final warning." Louis looked up. "You gave up that right when you gave up your conscience." There was a pause. It wasn't the words, it was the way they landed. The woman ranger checked her radio. "HQ says to wait. Apparently we have incoming." "Incoming what?" the taller ranger asked. She didn't answer, but Louis did. "They remember," he said softly. That's when it happened. A black SUV rolled down the street, slow, deliberate, government plates. It pulled up to the curb with surgical precision. Doors didn't open right away. The crowd hushed. Louis looked at the vehicle, not with surprise, but recognition. He placed one hand on his heart. Over a hidden chain beneath his layers, he whispered a name. The ranger looked nervous now. The crowd wasn't filming for content anymore. They were watching something shift. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just drives in quietly and waits. The driver's side door opened first. A young man in civilian dress stepped out and said nothing. Then the passenger door clicked open, and out stepped a woman in full U.S. Army dress blues. Crisp, pressed, and silent. Her ribbons gleamed. Her heels clicked softly on the stone path. She walked slowly, eyes focused on one thing only. The man on the bench. Louise didn't move. Until she did something no one expected. She stopped 2 feet in front of him and knelt. Not out of pity. Out of protocol. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," she said formally. "Colonel Amelia Carson, 18th Airborne Corps. I've been looking for you." The ranger stuttered. "Ma'am, this is a homeless encampment case." She raised one hand. Silenced him with a single glance. "He's not homeless," she said. "He's misplaced. There's a difference." Louise looked at her, eyes glassy, voice quiet. "I didn't think anyone remembered." "We never forgot," she replied. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "Your name came up in our audit of unprocessed discharge honors. You were never issued your final commendation." She extended the paper. Louise didn't take it. Not yet, because that's when the third vehicle pulled in behind the SUV. And from it stepped 4 men, all in dress blues. No cameras. No orders. Just salutes. The air thickened with reverence. The bench had been just wood and steel yesterday. Now it felt like a podium. Colonel Carson stood. The other officers approached, forming a line behind her. Each one removed their cover, their military hats, and held them respectfully at their side. The park was utterly silent. The wind had stopped. The birds had stopped. Even the city itself seemed to pause. Louise remained seated, one hand still resting on the flag. "We pulled your service record, sir," one of the officers said. "What they did to you was bureaucratic failure at its worst." You disappeared from the system, but not from the ranks. Luis nodded slowly. I didn't want to meddle, he said. I just want to come home. Colonel Carson's voice softened. Then let us bring you home, properly. She turned to the female ranger. Ma'am, with respect, we are reclaiming the space for a military ceremony. The ranger blinked. In a public park? Yes, the colonel replied, where he earned the right to sit. Luis rose slowly, not out of obedience, but dignity. Someone in the crowd began clapping. Soft, respectful. Then another, and another. The moment cracked something open. Years of silence. Years of being ignored. And Luis, standing tall, nodded to the officers. Let's finish it, he said. And with that, the ceremony began, not just to honor his past, but to reclaim his name. Just as the makeshift ceremony was about to begin, the echo of a voice shattered the moment. This is a misuse of public resources, someone shouted from the crowd. A man in a suit, red-faced, pushed through the onlookers. I work for the Parks Department. This isn't authorized. This man is trespassing. Louis stiffened. The officers turned. Colonel Carson's eyes narrowed. He has no home, the man barked. You're glorifying a squatter. Do this in a VFW, not in the middle of a public park. The crowd shifted, unsure. Phones lowered. The tension that had just begun to melt now coiled tight again. Louis sat back down, suddenly exhausted. His spine curled forward, shoulders heavy. I knew it, the parks officer said. You people just want a spectacle. You think putting on a uniform excuses everything. Carson took a slow step forward, but it was Luis who spoke. My uniform never excused me. It demanded more of me, every day. The man scoffed. Then maybe you should have stayed in the army, not become the city's problem. The colonel clenched her jaw. This man was a solution to this country's problems, while men like you were sitting behind desks pushing papers. But the damage had been done. The tone of the crowd shifted. Some people began walking away. The clapping stopped. Luis looked down at the folded letter on his lap. His hand trembled slightly. He felt again that awful weight of being uninvited in your own home. Not just the city, the country. He whispered, maybe I should just go. But someone else heard him. Someone who wasn't in uniform. Someone who wasn't part of the plan. And that changed everything. From the back of the crowd, a boy stepped forward. Maybe 12, maybe 13. Freckles, oversized jacket, shoes worn thin. He walked through the silence like it didn't scare him. In his hands, a crumpled notebook. He stood in front of Luis, chest puffed out, eyes wide with something that looked like awe. My brother's in the army, he said. I never met anyone like him. Till now. He opened the notebook. Inside was a sketch, rough, pencil drawn, of a soldier standing beside an American flag. In bold block letters, real hero. He held it out. You look just like the guy I drew. Louis stared at the boy. Then, slowly, he took the drawer with both hands. You drew this? He asked softly. The boy nodded. I saw you here last week. You looked like someone who used to be important. Luis let out a shaky breath. Kid, I didn't used to be. I still am. Then, without being told, the boy turned and stood at attention. His posture was clumsy, his boots uneven, but he stood tall, still, unmoving. Colonel Carson watched him, then saluted. The officers followed, and the crowd, hesitant, unsure, rose again. One by one. Some stood straight, some bowed their heads. A few saluted. Others simply held their phones down and their hands over their hearts. Even the parks official looked around and said nothing more. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about presence. And for the first time in years, Luis Rodriguez felt like a man the world saw. Tears welled up behind Luis's eyes, but they didn't fall. He stood slowly, hands gripping the edge of the bench, as the boy stepped back. Colonel Carson turned toward the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to correct something far overdue. Master Sergeant Luis M. Rodriguez served this country with distinction for 24 years. He carried men through firefights, built bridges under mortar fire, and trained units that still serve today. His discharge and final commendation were lost in the system, but his honor never was. She unfolded the letter in her hands. By order of the Department of the Army, we recognize and formally present the Distinguished Service Commendation to Master Sergeant Rodriguez for exemplary conduct in active operations against enemy forces. She turned, holding the framed certificate and medal, stepping toward Luis. But Luis held up a hand. "Give it to the kid," he said, voice steady. Carson blinked. "Excuse me." He pointed to the boy. "Let him carry it. Let him remember that this uniform means something. That respect doesn't need an address." The boy approached hesitantly. Luis placed the medal in his small hands. "You guard that," he said. "Not for me. For everyone watching." The boy nodded fiercely, clutching it like a sacred relic. The park erupted in quiet applause. Not loud, not staged, just real. For the first time in decades, Luis didn't feel like he was proving his worth. He felt returned. The officers left one by one, boots silent on the sidewalk, but their impact still echoing in the air. Colonel Carson stayed a moment longer. "You have a place now," she said softly. "We've arranged housing, clean sheets, warm meals, no press, no cameras, just dignity." Luis smiled faintly. "You really think I can start over?" She shook her head. "You're not starting over. You're picking up where they dropped you." He looked toward the bench, the flag, the boy still holding his medal, beaming with pride. Then toward the skyline, the same skyline he'd watched from that bench for years. But somehow now it looked different, brighter, bigger. "I'll come tomorrow," he said. "Today, I just want to sit." She nodded. "Then you sit, and we'll stand." And she did, behind him, not as a commanding officer, but as a shield. Luis leaned back, not to retreat, but to rest. The city pulsed on. Cars rolled by. Dogs barked. Phones buzzed. But within that little circle of grass and stone, it felt like time had knelt beside him and said, "Welcome back." The video, of course, went viral. Someone had recorded the moment the colonel saluted. Then the boy. Then the crowd. By morning, news anchors were calling him the invisible sergeant. But Luis didn't care about headlines. He cared about what came next. The bench? It stayed right where it was. But the city quietly added a plaque. In honor of Master Sergeant Luis M. Rodriguez, defender ground, keeper of dignity. A flower appeared beside it each morning. No one claimed responsibility. Teachers brought students to visit. Veterans began sitting near him, unannounced, just to talk. The kid? His name was Ethan. He wrote a school essay titled, "The Day My Hero Had No House." His teacher framed it. And Luis? He moved into a small unit, in a quiet building just 3 blocks away. Every day, he walked to the bench. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. One day, a man in a suit passed and nodded respectfully. "I used to work with the Parks Department," he said. "I misjudged you." Luis said nothing, just nodded. Some salutes are silent. Late that fall, as yellow leaves danced across the sidewalk and the sun dipped low, Luis sat quietly on his bench. He wore a fresh jacket now, gifted from a local unit. His flag rested in his lap. A group of recruits marched past on a training run. One peeled off, breathless, and stopped before him. "Sir," he said, standing tall, "my father told me about you." Luis smiled gently. "Tell him I'm still here," he said. The recruit saluted. Luis returned it, slow and steady. As the young man rejoined his unit, the sound of synchronized footsteps faded down the block. Luis closed his eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in peace. The wind whispered through the trees, and if you listened closely, you could almost hear the words he never said out loud. "I never left the battlefield. I just brought it home with me."